from the south of England. So they didn't need big locomotives, but they did need locomotives that could accelerate fast and haul heavy passenger trains, because they're supporting the commuters into London. And they were the first railway to go third rail electric. What's the word for it? Multiple units. And they were doing that from very early on, because their lines were shorter, so they didn't, and so, the problem with electrifying from London to Scotland is it's 400 miles. That's a lot of electrification to do, whereas most of the southern railway lines were very short and very easy to electrify a length of and then run electric multiple units up and down. Okay, I'm going to sell that. Yay. Because we bought ourselves a new tractor. So we have a Magnum 400 Case IH with tracks, with the biggest engine possible. So horsepower upgrade and horsepower upgrade. So this is now our most powerful tractor. But anyway, so they were the four. Then Second World War happened, and again the government was insisting that the railroad companies transfer all the war equipment pretty much for less than cost, if not free. And so at the end of the Second World War, even these four major railroad companies didn't have the money to maintain their lines, repair the lines after the bombing. And so at that point, the British government said, we're just going to take over the railways. A Labour government had got in, which is the equivalent of Democrat in America, and they just said, we're going to nationalise the railways, we're going to take it all over and we're going to run it. Now, one of the things they did was they got a guy called, I think Richard Beeching, to do a report on which were the most profitable, least profitable lines, and with the intent of closing off the least profitable lines. We don't need them anymore, they're just costing us money. Now, what the British government didn't understand, but the component railroad companies did understand, is your trunk routes don't make you money, but they bring passengers to your main line, and that's where the money's made. And if you stop providing passengers from the trunk to the main line, those passengers have to find another way to get to where they want to go. And a lot of them were getting cars. So they closed the trunk routes expecting, well, British Rail will now make more money. It was then called, by that time it was called British Railways, later shortened to British Rail. But British Rail said, we're going to make lots more money because we're going to get rid of all the lines that lose us money. And of course what they hadn't banked on was, well, the lines that lose you money are actually keeping the lines that are making you money supplied with people and freight. And so closing those lines off actually resulted in lower income from the main lines. And it was all a big mess. So, British Railways rebranded to British Rail around 1970, just after. And then they privatised the train companies but kept the rails nationalised. Early 90s, I want to say. So, Britain is now back to, the trains are run by private companies, but the tracks are maintained by British Railways. Or, I can't remember what the company's called now, but yeah, rails and signalling are the responsibility of a government-run corporation. Although I think it's fairly self-sustaining because they charge a usage fee to all of the smaller rail companies. That's where, you know, the technicality of British Railways or British Rail and the Railways of Britain. British Railways is an entity. Was an entity. British Rail is an entity. Well, again, was an entity. Whereas the Railways of Britain were hundreds of small companies all doing their own thing. I do not need the baler anymore. Just a thought. We'll turn that off there. Oh, okay. So now let's go check the weather. The weather. It is going to rain until 10 o'clock. But the other thing I did want to check was here. So you can see we're leaving a straw swath behind us. This ground has a fairly good nitrogen content. Much better than this land. In fact, better than grass. So one thing we need to keep track of is if we are if we're planning to put grass into this field after we have cut it, we probably want to create straw like we did here so that the pH is basically 20. It's 40. So it needs 20 kilos per hectare to bring it up to 40, which is what our grass field, or 60, which is what our grass fields need. Whereas this is way too much for grass, and we will actually lose. I think this is the point, we would actually lose yield of grass. But that said, because we're up at 100, 120, topping it back off to what oats needs, we only have to put 20 to 40 kilos per hectare back into the soil to bring it up to what oats needs. Now, corn is a completely different animal and is 120, 160, not 140, 120, oh okay, but needs a lot more nitrogen, so it's going to take some to get to there. But anyway, so, and that's the efforts of what do we have running? Conservation, agriculture, something like that. There was a mod that came out week before last, which I added to the playthrough. But yes, if we're going to cycle arable crops only through these fields, then we're going to be looking at chopping rather than straw, and I don't mind that. It does remove the need for me to have a square baler anymore, because, well, maybe not. I mean, we can always do contracts which need square balers. Anyway, let's speed up time a bit. So yeah, my knowledge of US railroads is kind of lacking. I do live in Jackson in Michigan, which was a major railroad hub. We had, I think it was something like 5 railroads ran into Jackson from all points of the compass. There were a number of freight yards and depots and all sorts of things.
Hi.
And hi. So yeah, that's one of my hobbies, no matter whether I'm in England or the USA, is to look for evidence of trains used to be here. Because, yes, in the UK after the during the 1950s, 1960s, a lot of old railroads were closed. And so there is evidence, a bridge over a river with nothing on top of it. Actually, you know what we're going to do? Drive over here and line up here. I think that is, we'll do it at 90 degrees, we'll set up a GPS for this. So auto width, A plus heading is 90. Alright, and we're at line 0 and I want to be probably line 3. Come on, 1, 2, actually 2, line 2 we'll go for, row 2. That's good, turn that on, we'll turn, oh, yes, we need to unfold that. But yeah, as far as sort of British locomotive technology was concerned, in the 1820s, the Great Western settled on a 7-foot railroad gauge, with the premise that A, the trains could go faster, they could carry more fuel, you could have bigger boilers so they were more powerful, they could go around corners quicker because of the wider stance, and the passenger cars were more comfortable because they were really wide. Conversely, everybody else went with Stephenson's standard, which is the 4-foot 8.5 inch gauge. And that meant everybody else. It was only the Great Western that used 7 foot. So, sort of the mid-1800s, Parliament said, you can't build any more 7-foot gauge lines. You can keep the ones you've got, but you can't build any new ones. The problem we're having is, whenever you ship something from South Wales or Cornwall or wherever, and want it to go to a place like Birmingham, somewhere along the way you have to pull all of the freight traffic into an exchange and unload them and load up standard gauge cars in order to get to Birmingham, Manchester, whatever. So British government wasn't impressed with that, so they said no more 7-foot built, but you can keep what you have. And then towards the end of the 1800s, the Great Western just said it's so much of a hassle running dual gauge across at least the main parts of our network. We're just going to standardise on standard gauge. So they switched everything over to standard gauge. They did modify some of their rolling stock that could be modified to run standard gauge. All of the rest of it was scrapped. And Britain became 4-foot 8.5 inch. And because British Empire, everywhere that Britain created railroads was built at 4-foot 8.5. America had a crazy, there was no standard in America. Different railroads decided to go with different gauges, so you could have 5 foot, you could have 4 foot, you could have 4-foot 8.5. Just depending on the railroad, different gauges, which made, because most of them built their own rolling stock or locomotives or were contracting out for them, they could specify anything. And most of the railroads didn't linked to each other, so it wasn't a problem getting freight from one point to another. They were only interested in servicing their line. In Britain, because Britain's small, there is a requirement to chop down trees in Scotland and cut the trees down to the south of England, and you need to be able to load up a rail car and just take it all the way where it needs to go and not transfer stuff from one car to, one gauge to another. The diesels, British Railways took over in 1948. And their first thing was, we have inherited hundreds of different locomotives, and all of them need to be serviced, and that's a problem. So they decided to standardize their fleet, and basically created a range of what they called standard locomotives. They had a power classification which ran from 0 to 9. Under the BR standard models, they didn't drop below 2, so they had a 2 mixed traffic tender engine and a 2 mixed traffic tank engine, depending on where they were intended to run. Tender engine could run on a longer line than a tank engine, and then they went 2 all the way up to 9. Standard models, they were all 2-cylinder, they all had the cylinders on the outside to make maintenance easy, they had high running boards so you could get at everything, all the brake lines and everything else, which was not necessarily a feature of the original component companies, what they called the main four. They still allowed the main four to build locomotives that were already established. So we already have, you've already got the LNER A3, which is what the Flying Scotsman was it A1? Can't remember. But they could build more of that model because it was tried and tested. They weren't allowed to invent new ones. Round about the mid-50s, they had seen the LMS had trialled out a couple of diesel locomotives. Not many, a couple of prototypes, but they were already seeing that these diesel locomotives were actually quite successful. They were better than steam, they were more efficient than steam. You only had to provide diesel, you didn't have to provide water and coal, and carry water and coal. On the southern region, they found, we've already got 3-rail electric, let's just do the whole thing 3-rail electric. Elsewhere in the country, they understood that 3-rail electric wasn't going to happen because it's just too expensive. So they did start on overhead line equipment, basically electric wires over the tracks to power electric trains with, and that happened on their high usage lines, not so much on the trunk lines initially. And even today, some of the trunk lines are not electrified. But with the diesels, once they decided we need diesels because they're good, they just tendered out. If you think you can build a diesel engine or a diesel locomotive for us, just build one. And they had a number of successful ones. Things like, I think it was the Brush Type 4 and the Sulzer Type 3 were incredibly successful. And then they had others that had mechanical issues. They had more than one that was just a fire risk and actually burst into flames a number of times. You don't see those anywhere anymore. All of with steam locomotives, they had classes. So class 1 to class 0 to class 9. And that denoted the power of the vehicle. With diesels, they had type 0 to type 5. So the type 0s were strictly shunters. They worked the freight yards, sorting out all of the freight in the big freight yards. Now, to a certain extent, those jobs went away because people had started moving to road traffic. So the small freight cars disappeared, and they ended up with sort of freight cars built on almost passenger frames. They had better speed, it was bulk lumber, bulk fuel, and bulk minerals. Oops, I did that wrong. Let's turn it on. And all of the smaller class 1 diesels, or type 1 diesels, basically got retired. A lot of those were the ones that were unreliable, deadly. They just got retired. Didn't need them anymore. That freight traffic disappeared. They were going to diesel multiple units for passengers, and diesel multiple units were very successful. But some of the companies they used to build mainline diesels were probably not a good plan. But as I said, the ones that worked, and the brush type 4 was renumbered the class 47s, and they're still in use today, or they took the engine out and put a type 5 engine in it, and it became a class 56. And I think they upgraded the engine again to a more powerful engine and kept the frames. There was nothing wrong with the frames. They were very, very reliable. The only thing they did early on was, I believe the horsepower rating on the locomotive was dropped about 400 horsepower because they found that I think slightly over 3,000 horsepower that the engine was putting out put a little bit too much strain on the locomotive or the engine, and so they derated it by 400. And as I said, it served from the early 1960s all the way up to today. Long life. The other problem now, initially the Type 8s, I would need to know which show, but diesel from the show, from Thomas the Tank Engine. The early diesels only went up to Type 5s, and there were very few of those. The Type 7 series was electric. No, the Type 8 series was electric. So basically when they had overhead wire, or electric, strictly electrics, those were numbered from 80 upwards, 80 to 89. The 90 range is used for departmental locomotives, and those can actually be any power class, and also all of the heritage locomotives, all the old steam locomotives that still run on the main lines, are actually numbered in the 9. Officially their number is 9, 7, and then 3 digits after it, regardless of how big they are, how powerful they are. You never see that 9 90 series classification on a steam locomotive, because it will be using its running number from when it was actually in revenue service back in the pre-1960s. There's the departmental locomotives, which are owned by basically the track maintenance unit. They own a series of locomotives of all power types, and it really depends on, are we relaying a major stretch of line, in which case we want one of our more powerful locomotives, or are we just doing spot maintenance somewhere, in which case we'll use an old Type 2 to haul a couple of cars and a passenger car to get that work done. So, yeah, but that's really, what it is these days. I think they're getting to the point, if they haven't completed all of the main lines from London to somewhere significant, are now all electrified. Some of the trunk lines, which still exist, they're currently exploring battery trains to run, battery multiple units, and the way they can get away with that is the battery can be recharged at each end. So the train usually has a 30-minute turnaround, and it might take 10-20 minutes to run the line. It'll run down the line, it'll stop at the end, it'll connect to the batteries or the local power supply, recharge the batteries, and then up and head back down, and then recharge the batteries at the other end. It doesn't need a full charge, it's just a spot charge at each end. But it's basically the British government has said we don't want trains running on diesel anymore, and so all the railway companies have done and basically said, okay, so we're not going to do diesels. What we will do is try and create battery trains on the lines that, why am I spending £10,000 or hundreds of thousands of pounds putting up overhead line equipment for a 20-mile line? Kind of not cost effective, but to buy a battery train and just do that. No, actually that was where I wanted to be. Why did I park this here? I don't know. So, yeah, it's a very varied thing these days. Most trains in England aren't built in England. You've got some of the older units renovated. And what have you, that are still running there, but there are